Okay, good afternoon. So it's such a pleasure to be here, and thanks the opportunity to the chair and opportunity to intellect, and also a very good evening to all the fellow panelists. So before I take the question, I also want to touch upon the larger objective of what do large tertiary institutions are looking at skill building, because I'm from IIT and I want to share some of my perspectives here. So if we kind of look at an higher education institution, broadly we can look at it in two categories. One is the research-based institutions and the other is teaching-focused institutions, right? I'm kind of broadly defining these two. Right? And in a teaching-focused institution, I think the primary motive is generally is to kind of prepare the students for the job market. And ultimately, whether we like it or not, people are studying because they will get a good job, or they will get they'll be able to shift the job from one career to other and so on. So job is a very important reason for why people are pursuing education today, whether we like it or not. Then we have the research-based institutions. So for a long time, one of the major objectives of the research-based institutions was to generate new knowledge. So there is no clear black and white here. Even in research-based institutions, there is a lot of emphasis on teaching, and even in research and training institutions, there will be a lot of emphasis on research. So, but at a very two polar levels, we have teaching and research-based. So for a long time, the research-based institutions were more concerned about how do I really break new knowledge, which is measured in terms of how many publications that's going to come out, and what is the impact factor of these publications, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a reason for that. I mean, if you look at some of the top institutions, many of these institutions are worried, right? And what is the worry about? The worry is about whether, as an institution, they will lose their relevance in the world, right? Whether they will be in a position to meet what people are looking for. So there are some people who call these institutions are being paranoid, right? And they are very reason for it. They think that they will lose their relevance. And in order for these institutions not to lose the relevance, what they are trying to do, they want to not be reactive, but then they want to actually be very proactive. So they don't want to respond to the industry, but instead tell the industry that this is where the world will be in a few years from now, and this is what you should look at. So if we can tell the world in terms of what direction it's going to go, then there is no question of you losing the relevance. So this was one thought that kind of pervades with many of these top institutions, research-based institutions. But what we are seeing today is many of these top institutions are not just satisfied with breaking new ground, but they also want to see how this new knowledge is in some form can be transformed to skills. So how can we actually move one step downstream and see if we can transform this knowledge to skills? So ultimately, we look at knowledge and skills. What is the big difference? Knowledge has a little bit more permanence to it, right? So knowledge is going to exist for a very long time, whereas skills are a lot more temporal in nature. We might have to constantly keep on upgrading our skills, right? So today there could be focus on one, tomorrow it could be the other. So the same person might have to revisit and retool himself to upgrade his skills, but knowledge is a lot more permanent, right? So as some of these institutions are looking at trying to create skills, the process of skilling from this knowledge, several initiatives are happening. So if I take the example of IIT Madras, so today IIT Madras has introduced new courses which are purely on skills mode. For example, there is a BS program on data science, right? That's not actually taught in the classroom, but actually you taught in the online mode, right? It's purely a skilling based. And the objective is to see how we could kind of look at some of the cutting edge knowledge that we have developed over time and really give it to situations where people can look at getting high quality jobs in this particular area. A second aspect that people are doing in most of the institutions is creating incubators, right? What is this incubators fundamentally doing, right? So these incubators are essentially trying to see if we can actually take the ideas that is coming out of the lab and make it to the real world. Right? the innovations and the inventions can be commercialized. So that's what the incubations are supposed to do. And the incubators cannot do it on their own. Obviously, they need a vehicle as a startup which can actually do that job of transforming this knowledge and innovations to the real world, right? And for that, there is a lot of skill is needed, right? The skill is needed in terms of engineering skills, from lab to make it to a product. Skill is needed in terms of making that product market ready. Skill is needed for making a market ready product to kind of looking at what the customer needs and then communicating it to the customer. Skill is needed for servicing that product. There are so many skills that are needed, which actually is what is happening in the incubator and in the startup ecosystem. So this is not being explicitly mentioned by many of these institutions. Ultimately, setting up of this ecosystem is one way of reaching out and communicating how knowledge can be translated into skills, right? There are several other initiatives also happening, right? The focus is on seeing how we could kind of patenting, right? So why do people patent? The patent actually happens because then something that's very implicit knowledge in terms of the faculty, it gets now documented, right? And this documentation, once it is done, can actually help in skill building, right? So some of these activities, without being explicitly mentioned, so is an outreach by many of these institutions to see how we can build skills. Because ultimately, as we are all looking at, skilling is needed. The process of transforming knowledge to skills is very important because we all need to give jobs. And if our country has to really grow, jobs are important. And knowledge may not directly result in jobs. For example, I can understand about cost of capital. That's a knowledge. I mean, if I'm teaching finance, I'm talking about an example in finance. Cost of capital is knowledge, but then how can I use that knowledge to create a capital structure that's very efficient for the company? That's a skill, right? So this is something that that's what I think the world requires, and that's what I think many of the institutions are today trying to do so in a variety of ways.